I didn't set out to reconstruct a civilization that supposedly never existed. But when you spend enough time examining the architectural remains, the industrial artifacts, the photographic evidence from the mid-1800s through early 1900s, you begin to notice something unsettling. Not just what's there, but what's missing. The absence of explanation. The gaps in the historical record. The story we've been told about this period doesn't match the physical evidence. Not the buildings that remain. Not the infrastructure still visible beneath our streets. Not the photographs that show a world far more sophisticated than official history allows. Walk through any major city built before 1900 and you'll see windows half buried at street level, doorways leading nowhere, architectural details that begin underground. We're told these are basements, but basements don't have ornate street-facing facades. Basements don't have grand entrance porticos now sitting 8 feet below the sidewalk. The official explanation is simple. Cities naturally rise. Garbage accumulation, flood deposits, construction debris. Over centuries, the ground level slowly increases. Except this explanation requires us to believe that between roughly 1650 and 1850, ground levels across dozens of cities on multiple continents all rose by 6 to 12 feet. Not gradually over millennia, within centuries, during a period we're told had primitive waste management and limited urban development. Ask yourself how that works. How does ground level rise uniformly across an entire city while the buildings remain perfectly intact? How do stone structures with foundations designed for specific depths simply adapt to having their first floors buried? Why do we see this pattern in cities separated by oceans? Cities with completely different climates, different geologies, different populations, all experiencing the same ground level increase during the same narrow time window. The silence is telling. What we're looking at isn't explained by slow accumulation. What we're looking at is evidence of an event, something that happened, something that deposited material rapidly enough to bury the ground floors of structures while leaving upper floors intact. Something global enough to affect cities from Boston to Moscow to Melbourne. But before we can understand what happened, we need to establish what existed before it happened. And that's where the architectural evidence becomes unavoidable. Consider the photographs from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The official story tells us that an exposition covering 686 acres, featuring over 100 buildings with massive domes, classical facades, elaborate plasterwork, and coordinated infrastructure was designed and built in approximately 2 years by a city that 22 years earlier had burned to the ground using temporary materials with hand tools and horse-drawn equipment, then completely demolished within months of closing. Look at the photographs. The buildings show uniform cornice heights across dozens of structures, matching architectural elements, coordinated waterways, electrical systems. The largest building ever constructed at that time, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, covering over 30 acres under a single roof, built in 2 years, with plaster and wood, then destroyed. The question becomes unavoidable. Were these buildings actually constructed for the fair, or were they already there? Were dozens of similar expositions held globally during this period, all featuring remarkably similar architecture, all built impossibly quickly, all demolished immediately? Afterward, actually construction projects, or were they something else? Inventories of existing structures, documentation of what remained before it was systematically removed. Because here's what the photographic record shows. Cities across the world in the 1850s through 1880s feature massive public buildings, ornate private structures, sophisticated infrastructure. Then, between roughly 1880 and 1920, there's a pattern. Major fires: Chicago, 1871, Boston, 1872, San Francisco, 1906. Devastating fires in dozens of cities, often destroying the most architecturally significant districts. After each fire, rapid reconstruction, new buildings replacing old. But the new buildings are different, simpler, built to different standards, using different techniques. The official explanation is that cities modernized. Old structures were replaced with new, but that's not what the photographs show. What they show is architectural sophistication being replaced with architectural simplification, complex masonry giving way to brick, intricate plasterwork replaced with plain facades, buildings that took theoretical decades to build being replaced in months. And beneath it all, literally beneath the new street level, the old architecture remains, not deteriorated, not primitive, sophisticated, mathematical, showing evidence of construction techniques we supposedly didn't possess. Examine the basement windows visible in cities worldwide. These aren't basements. The architectural details make that clear. These are ground floor structures with street-level entrances, now buried. The stonework around these buried openings shows the same level of sophistication as the visible upper floors, the same mathematical precision, the same evidence of industrial scale. Production. Official history tells us the 1800s were pre-industrial, that most construction was local, individual, done by hand. But the buildings themselves contradict this. The standardization is impossible to ignore. Crown molding that repeats with identical dimensions across thousands of buildings. Plasterwork, showing the same geometric patterns in cities separated by oceans. Window frames with matching proportions. Brick dimensions that are uniform not just within cities, but across continents. This isn't the work of individual craftsmen arriving at similar solutions independently. This is evidence of industrial production, of standardized manufacturing, of distribution networks sophisticated enough to deliver identical building components to cities worldwide during a period when we're told international trade moved by sailing ship, when transcontinental communication took months, when most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. The question isn't whether these systems existed. The physical evidence proves they did. The question is why our historical record doesn't acknowledge them. Why the infrastructure we can still see, still measure, still document is absent from the official narrative. Because it's not just the buildings, it's what the buildings imply. Infrastructure this sophisticated requires coordination, continental and intercontinental coordination. It requires standardized measurement systems, communication networks, transportation systems capable of moving massive quantities of materials over vast distances. It requires centralized planning on a scale official history claims didn't exist. Until the mid-20th century, the canal systems tell the same story. Across Europe, Asia, North America, we find canal networks of impossible precision, cut through solid rock, maintaining grades that allow water to flow across hundreds of miles with minimal elevation change, featuring lock systems that show identical engineering solutions across different continents, all supposedly built with primitive tools by independent nations that had limited contact with each other, all arriving at the same solutions, all during the same general time period. Ask yourself how primitive societies build infrastructure that modern engineering struggles to replicate. How do they move millions of tons of earth and rock without powered machinery? How do they achieve surveying precision that requires instruments we supposedly didn't invent until centuries later? How do they coordinate construction across continental distances without modern communication? The official narrative has an answer for each individual question, but it doesn't have an answer for all of them together. It doesn't explain the pattern, the global coordination, the technological sophistication, the mathematical precision, the sudden appearance of this infrastructure in the historical record, followed by its equally sudden disappearance from how we talk about this period. Because that's what's really missing, not the physical evidence that remains, buried and half-buried, visible to anyone who looks. What's missing is the acknowledgement, the explanation, the historical framework that accounts for what we can still see. Instead, we get fragmentation, compartmentalization. The canal systems are explained as individual regional projects, each one a separate story, no connection acknowledged between them. The buried architecture is explained city by city, each one supposedly rising independently through garbage accumulation and flood deposits. Despite showing the same burial depth, across vastly different contexts, the standardized building components are explained through cultural influence and trade, without accounting for the scale or precision of the standardization. Everything is explained individually. Nothing is explained collectively. And in that fragmentation, the larger pattern becomes invisible, not because the evidence isn't there, but because looking at it as a unified whole requires asking questions the official narrative can't answer. What if these weren't separate developments? What if the sophisticated architecture, the continental infrastructure, the evidence of global coordination all point to the same thing? Not separate civilizations slowly developing similar solutions, but a unified civilization, one that existed during the period we call pre-industrial, one that had technological capabilities official history doesn't acknowledge, one that left physical evidence we can still measure and document, one that experienced something that caused its sudden collapse. The photographic evidence from the mid to late 1800s shows something remarkable. Empty cities, major urban centers with elaborate architecture, but almost no people. Streets lined with sophisticated buildings, but devoid of the crowds you'd expect in population centers. Market squares that can hold thousands. Photographed completely empty. This isn't photographer's choice. Early photography required long exposures, yes, but not long enough to erase all evidence of population from cities of supposedly hundreds of thousands. These photographs show aftermath, not construction in progress, not cities rising, but cities being repopulated, being reoccupied, being re-inhabited after something that significantly reduced their populations. The timeline is visible in the records, if you know what to look for. Between roughly 1810 and 1850, there's a gap, not in the historical record we have records, but in the continuity. Birth records show anomalies. Census data shows discrepancies. Immigration records show massive population movements that don't quite align with the official explanations for why people were moving. And then, after 1850, there's a pattern of aggressive historical revision. Old maps are redrawn. Place names are changed. Regions that were labeled as unified territories for centuries are suddenly subdivided, renamed. Their previous designations disappeared from new atlases, as if something that existed was being systematically erased from the cartographic record. This is where Tartaria enters the evidence, not as a conspiracy theory, as a cartographic fact. For centuries, maps labeled a vast region of Eurasia as Tartaria or Tartary, not a vague designation, a specific territory, with borders, with cities, with infrastructure, appearing on official maps from every major European power, acknowledged in encyclopedias, referenced in diplomatic correspondence, a known entity in the geopolitical landscape. And then, between roughly 1850 and 1900, it vanishes, not gradually, not through conquest or dissolution documented in the historical record. It simply disappears from maps, replaced by new designations, new political boundaries, new names, as if something that was there was decided to no longer exist. The official explanation is that Tartaria was never a unified entity, just a cartographic convenience, a catch-all term for poorly understood regions. But that explanation doesn't account for the consistency with which it appears in maps across centuries and cartographers. It doesn't explain why the territory was labeled with specific borders if it was just a vague designation. It doesn't address why encyclopedias described it as a distinct region if it had no distinct reality. What it does explain is how something can be removed from history, not by destroying the evidence. The maps still exist, available in archives for anyone who wants to examine them, but by recontextualizing it, by declaring it a mistake, by saying that what generations of cartographers documented wasn't real, that what was on every major map for centuries was just a misunderstanding. Once you accept that framework, the physical evidence becomes invisible. The buildings remain, but they're no longer connected to what they actually represent. The infrastructure endures, but it's explained away as separate local developments. The coordination is undeniable, but it's reframed as coincidence. And the collapse, the event that buried the ground floors and disrupted the populations, and created the need for massive reconstruction, that disappears entirely, fragmented into dozens of local explanations. Fires here, floods there, earthquakes elsewhere, each event isolated, each one given its own cause, the pattern rendered invisible through compartmentalization. but the evidence resists compartmentalization. The buried architecture is too uniform. The timeline is too compressed. The reconstruction is too coordinated. The historical revision is too systematic. Something happened between roughly 1810 and 1850. Something that affected populations globally. Something that deposited enough material to bury ground-level architecture across multiple continents. Something that required extensive reconstruction and repopulation of major urban centers. Something that prompted a systematic revision of maps and historical records in the decades that followed. We see its effects in the physical evidence. We see the response in the historical record. What we don't see is the event itself. That's been removed, not the traces of it. Those remain, visible to anyone willing to look at the pattern, rather than the compartmentalized explanations. But the acknowledgement of it, the unified explanation that accounts for all the evidence together. This is what the architectural remains are telling us, not through what they show, but through what they imply, through the questions they raise that official history can't adequately answer, through the patterns they reveal when you examine them collectively rather than in isolation. Were we told the truth about this period? Or were we told a version of history that makes the evidence invisible by fragmenting it into pieces too small to show the pattern? The buildings remain, half buried, misattributed, explained away, but they remain, waiting for anyone willing to ask the question official history avoids. If this is what survived, what was it that collapsed?